Hey guys, I'm excited to finally announce my new app that I've been working on for the last month. It's called Pensato, and it's available for both iPhone and iPad. It's a universal app. I'll put a link in the description so you can download it if you're interested. What it is, it's an app to analyze and search a bunch of different musical scales, and then you're able to pick a few of your favorites and then analyze and see how they relate to each other. So I have it running here on my iPhone. And as you can see, this is what you see when you first launch it. So the main idea of the app is that you have essentially two things to do. One is just browse through scales and find scales. And the other one is you create sort of a scale progression, as I call it, which is just a collection of scales that you add to a list. When you start off, you're prompted to create your or add your first scale. And you have three different ways of doing that. So on the left here, you have your circle of fifths. So if I tap that, we can see that you have your standard circle of fifths, and this is just a way of representing how different notes and chords and scales relate to each other by either jumping in perfect fifth intervals around the circle or perfect fourths if you go the other way around. And then the inner circle shows you the relative minors of the majors that you see above. So in this case, you have your standard scales here. So for example, let's keep it simple and let's add the C major scale. So I'm going to tap on the C here. And so now we can see that I've added my C major scale and I can see what notes are in it. I can see all the chords that belong to that scale. And you have little Roman numerals that indicate what step in that scale the chord belongs to. For example, the 5 is called the dominant, and that's a very common chord chord to go to if you want to resolve back to the tonic or the root in this case. The app doesn't record music for you. It doesn't compose things for you. It's more of like think of it as like an intelligent piece of paper that you put in front of you as you're composing. The beauty of this app really starts when you start adding additional scales, because then you can start seeing how they relate to each other. So now to add another scale, again, below the scale, we have four different options here. You have the circle of fifths, which we saw. Then you have this little keyboard thing, which we'll get into in a second. That's a really complex way or a very powerful way to search and find scales. Next to that, you have this kind of related smart finder, which will suggest scales to go into based on certain properties. And at the end, this little magic wand is basically a random scale generator. So if I tap that, it'll just give me a random scale. And to delete a scale, you can just swipe right and push delete here. So let's start off with C major and let's tap on this little keyboard button in the middle here. So what this brings up is kind of like a scale finder. And there are over 1,400 different scales in this app for you to search and browse and kind of explore. So the way it works is that instead of searching for scales by name, you search for scales by notes. So this little keyboard at the bottom is your primary sort of input source. So I'm going to tap this little clear button in the middle here. And the way it works is that you can plug in as many root notes or general notes as you want. So for example, let's say I tap a D here. So now it's going to show me all the different scales that start with D. So now I can switch out and pick a different kind of note. So now I'm plugging in other notes. So let's say I want a scale that starts with D that also includes an F in it. So now I get my updated search results. So now you can keep plugging in different notes. And this is a great way to kind of find scales based on melodic ideas. So for example, let's say you start off and you had a melody in mind, like, so I played E flat, D, G, F, E flat. So let me clear this now. What I can do is I can plug in those notes. So D flat, E flat, F, G. So now it's telling me all the different scales that include these notes. And this is a great way to find interesting scales to approach. And in this one, I haven't selected a root note. As you can see, there's no red note selected. So what that means is it's giving me all different root notes that contain these notes. But of course, if I want to make it specific to a root note, I can switch the note here to red and then plug in, let's say, a C. So now it's going to show me all scales that start with C or that have a root note C that also include a D, an E flat, an F, and a G. And again, it's giving me this choice of notes here. And below each scale, you can see the information of how it relates to the previous scale in the list. So in this red banner at the top, you can see that the previous scale I had was a C major. And based on that, it's showing me recommendation. It's ordered by how closely related the scales in the list are to the previous one. And again, if you remember, one common thing to think about when you're trying to modulate from one scale to another is you want to find scales that are very closely related, that have lots of similar notes and chords to make the transition less drastic. So in this case, we can see that the C melodic minor, below that it says 6 notes and 4 chords in common. That means that in comparison to the C major scale I had, this is a very closely related scale. So to add this scale, again, I just tap on the scale I want to add. So let's say C melodic minor. And now what's cool is you can see that you're sort of building up your own little progression of scales. So in this case, I have C major and C melodic minor. So now the cool part is you'll notice that some of the chords are highlighted in blue. So let me explain what this means here. So if the entire chord is highlighted in blue, that means it's common to all the scales you have in your list. In addition, you'll notice there's these little blue banners or blue lines either above or below the chord name. What this means is that if the bar is above, it means that chord is shared with the previous scale. If it's below, that means it's shared with the next scale. So for example, I can go here and I can add another scale like F, for example. So now you can see the information slightly changes here. If we look at F major, we can see that F and D minor, since they have a bar at the top, that means that they're shared with the C melodic minor, which is above it. Similarly, if we look at C major and C melodic minor, you can see that D minor, F, G, and B diminished are shared between those two. But we can also see that if you notice that F and D minor have a blue background, and that means that they're equivalent or they're used in all three or all the scales you have in your list. So this is a good way to think about composing. So for example, you would open the app in front of you, pick a bunch of different scales that you want to experiment with. And now you know that if you play a D minor and an F at any point while you're transitioning from scale to scale, those chords will always make sense. Once you have this list of things that you can experiment with, you can start experimenting with different chord progressions that are either in the scale or in the next scale you want to go to. And this is just one simple example of the kinds of things you can do. And you can also edit the scale. So by swiping right on any given scale, it opens up an edit menu. So if, for example, I wanted to swap out the C melodic minor for something else, I can clear the menu again. And again, I can pick something in E, for example, like an E Locrian, and that'll just replace that. And all the chords that are in common will automatically update so you can quickly visualize. The idea here is to present you with information so you can quickly lock in on chords that are related and that'll work across. So you can use it either as a composition tool, which is what I like to use it for, or just as a learning tool. You can just experiment, search scales, see how they relate to each other, see what all the notes are in it. One other thing I want to mention in this mode here is you have this little lock icon. So what this allows you to do is it allows you to search for scales that match an exact set of notes. So if the lock is off, it'll loosely try to find scales that match the notes that you have here. If I turn the lock on, you'll notice it doesn't find anything. So it's waiting for me to plug in the exact set of notes. So for example, if I plug in a C major scale, you'll see C major appear. What this is useful for is you can start altering the notes one by one to see what other scales you come up with. So for example, here, let's say I remove the E and I plug in an E flat instead. You'll notice that it turns into a melodic minor. Or for example, I can change some of these notes here. We get a harmonic major, etc. Minor major. If I put this here, you get a minor, etc. So this is a good way to experiment and see, what if I just change this one note, or what if I remove this one note? What other scale do I get? The other thing I forgot to mention here is that these arrows are transpose buttons. So if you have something plugged in on the keyboard, you can quickly just transpose to see what other things in other roots you can find here. And finally, the other thing I want to mention on this screen is you have these little filter buttons. If you look at this button on the top right here, by default, I've selected it so that it's searching a very small set of scales just to keep things a little more focused. By default, you get the standard diatonic, so like your standard major scale modes. The melodic minor modes, harmonic minor modes, and harmonic major modes. But of course, you can enable blues, diminish, jazz, bebop, raga, and mela, which are kind of these Indian set of scale, classical Indian scales. And then I called it esoteric and exotic, which is basically every other scale. Some of them are slightly made up because it effectively, when you have 1,400 different scales, you're accounting for a huge variety of different combinations of notes, some of which aren't traditionally studied or even named. But I put it here because I wanted to have it kind of theoretically be complete so that no matter what combinations of note you pick, you'll always have something. Then at the bottom, you can toggle which number of notes you want to search. So by default, I've only picked 7, which gives you the heptatonic scales, which are your standard scales that you're all used to. Of course, if you pick 5, you'll get pentatonic scales, like more of the blue stuff. 12, you'll get the chromatic scale. And then you have a bunch of other combinations. 8, if you want more of the diminished or octatonic stuff. So you can play around with that. The more you enable, the more vast the library of searches. And the searches take a bit longer because there's so much data to go through. But by default, if you just want to stick with your standard major minor stuff, you can just leave the default settings there. But the other stuff are there too, if you wanted to explore that. And finally, let's look at the little suggested scale view, which is this little cluster of circles that you see at the bottom here. So if I tap that, again, it's all related to the previous scale you had on your list, which in this case was F major. So you have a bunch of different sections for suggesting different scales that you might want to transition into. So at the top, you have very common stuff that you would typically want to look for. So like the parallel minor, the supertonic, median, subdominant, dominant, and the relative minor. So these are all common scales that are very related to that scale that you might want to transition into. If I tap on the relative here, then we get all the different modes of that given scale. If we go to parallel, then we get all the modes, but starting with the same root as we're in right now. And then closely related will alter every note in the scale by 1 semitone, and it'll suggest what scales you can get. So for example, you can see here, if we raise the F to an F sharp, we get an F sharp altered. If we raise the F to an F sharp, we also get a G melodic minor. So for different roots, you might get different scales depending on what you alter. So again, this is a great way to find scales that are off just by 1 note. And that generally suggests that it's a very comfortable way to modulate into that scale because you have very little kind of drastic note changes. So that's another great way to quickly find a scale that is very closely related. So for example, I can pick an A minor. It says that the B flat is raised to a B. So if I pick that here, you can see that F major and A minor, which is enharmonic with the C major, or it's the relative of that. You can see that they're only off by 1 note. So they share a lot of chords in common. So this tells you that if you want to write a song, if you want to transition between F major and A minor, you'll get a very kind of pleasant transition between those two. And finally, at the top here, you have these 2 arrows. So this is a global transpose for all the scales. So for example, here I can just shift up and down. So let's say these are the scales I've picked and I'm in the middle of writing a song while looking at this chart here. I can easily transpose that. So for example, if I want to move up, I don't have to edit every scale. I can just globally kind of shift up and down. And then you have the global delete button at the top left if you just want to clear all the scales. And then finally, we have the settings menu here. So I just want to quickly go over what you can do here. There's these layout options at the top. So if this is too much information for you, you can switch things around. So I can make it so that it's only showing me the notes in the scales. I can also go and toggle off show names. So I can hide the names. And now you can see all the scales that you've picked. You can see the notes that are included. So this is a good way if you don't care about the name or the chords, you just want to be able to improvise certain melodies. And this gives you a quick chart of the kinds of notes you can pick while you're improvising. You can change the layout to only show chords if you wanted to, so we can hide the piano. Again, this is a great way for composing. You can kind of remove the names and all that. And effectively, it gives you a chart of chords that are potentially related to each other, and that'll give you pleasant chord progressions as you're playing. So instead of guessing and figuring out what chords you want to transition, here we basically have a grid of chords that you can now start improvising in. And it's made in such a way so that the blue stuff, if you focus your eye on that, that tells you that the blue stuff is related between the different scales so that you can quickly transition more smoothly if you're jumping from scale to scale. So again, it's a good way to either learn or to compose and improvise while looking at the app here. So again, the app doesn't produce any sound or there's no MIDI or anything like that. It's purely like a reference manual if you want to think of it that way. And for chords, by default, it's showing you triads, so 3-note chords. But you can switch it up here, chord size. I can pick a bigger one, and this gives you 4-note chords. So in this case, you can see We have an F major 7, G minor 7, A minor 7. So if you wanted to build a little more complex chords, this tells you what 4-note chords are part of that scale. If you're at all interested in learning more about this app or trying it out for yourself, I'll put the link in the description, so check it out and let me know what you think in the comments. There's also a contact form and a Facebook page. I'll link to that as well. Yeah, look out for another video. I'm gonna do more of like a things I learned or like a dev vlog type of thing. I don't know if you guys are interested in that stuff, but I thought it'd be cool to share that since my mind is kind of fresh off the development cycles here. There's definitely some stuff that I did that wasn't very efficient. I've redone a lot of stuff. I kind of went back and forth. So I've compiled a bit of lessons and learning. So I'll probably do a separate video for that, and check out the app. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you guys in the next.